The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is December the 3rd, 2021. My name is Michelle Pickford Bishop, your SMRO Professional Development Coordinator. We welcome you to the Provider's Fiscal Impact Analysis Tool training. Our presenters for today will be Robert White, the Director of Admin Services with DDA, as well as Drew Smith, our consultant from Alvarez and Marsal. Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants will be in listen-only mode, which means that you can hear us, but you cannot directly speak with us. If at any time during the presentation you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to write those questions, comments, or concerns in the question box that is located to the right of your screen within the control panel. If at any time you have any issues hearing us or seeing the presentation, it's recommended to log out of the system and log back into the system. For this particular training, we do have handouts, and they can be found and located and downloaded within the handout section that is also located in your control panel. With that, I will hand it over to Robert. Good afternoon, Robert.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, Michelle, and good afternoon to our participants. I want to welcome you to the training on the Provider Fiscal Impact Analysis tool. As mentioned in the communication, the tool has been updated to reflect the FY 2022 budgeted rates and is designed to compare the revenues that you all have received in PCIS 2 to projected revenues in the LTSS Maryland DDA module under the new budgeted rates. As you can all see here on the agenda, we will be giving you all an update and overview of the 2023 budgeted rate. We will then pivot into the training session on the tool, which will be led by Drew from Alvarez and Marsal, and questions and who to contact. And then we will end with a Q&A session and next steps. So just to give a little bit of background, the DDA contracted with Optimus back in the spring to conduct a final review of the rates and the methodology. Optimus is an actuarial firm that has been involved with Medicaid and the iterative rate setting process that they have in place, and have worked with us during the mandated rate study alongside JBGH. During that review, Optimus identified areas where the rate methodology varied from the original intent. As a result, we asked Optimus to stabilize the rates to ensure alignment with CMS approved rates and approach by ensuring that the rates are not just operationally sound, but also mathematically sound as well. During and as a part of the work to stabilize the rates, the DDA engaged with the Maryland Association of Community Services to review updates. Max provided us with approximately 8 printed pages of feedback, of which more than 50% was incorporated into the current fully loaded rates. But we're not finished yet. The Maryland Department of Health, with program and policy support from the DDA, will begin to convene stakeholders annually, starting in calendar year 2022, to review rates and to consider modifications or updates. And so this will be a new process for the DDA, but this process will ensure that our rates and policies are keeping current and keeping pace with changing trends and or mandated updates to home and community-based services. So this table shows the 2021 version 1 rates. And so these are the rates that are currently loaded in the LTSS DDA module. The 2021 version 2 rates reflect the work that Optimus has just concluded. As you can see, they are lower than what is currently loaded in LTSS. this difference of approximately 9% is the result of that stabilization work that we mentioned earlier that was conducted by Optimus during their review. And as you may have heard Bernie say more than a few times, new rates do not equal new funding. So with that said, based on the methodology and policy decisions included in the fully loaded rates and in collaboration with the Deputy Secretary of Healthcare Finance, we have developed a glide path that would allow the DDA to fund a proportion of the full rate. In the FY23 appropriation, DDA's budget request allows for the funding of 81% of the fully loaded rate blended across all categories of service. And then in working with Medicaid on further funding, we learned that we could leverage the ARPA funds to help support a successful and expedited transition into LTSS Maryland to get to a blended rate of 86%. The DDA and Optimus has analyzed the budgeted rates compared to those for like services in PCIS2, just to confirm that no rates for a service fall below the average rate for those in PCIS2. And so in looking at that analysis, we are looking at the PCIS2 rates with the 5.5% additional, that 5.5% retroactive increase on top of it. So that's what we're doing a comparison to. We also modeled a year-over-year sustainability plan that will continue to increase the total percentage of rates funded incrementally until we achieve a fully funded rate. The budgeted rates are the rates that were used to populate the provider fiscal impact analysis tool that you all will be trained on today. So here's the glide path that I mentioned previously that we have been managing to through this entire process. And the purpose of sharing the glide path today is just to illustrate how we get to a fully funded rate, starting with the implementation and ongoing through FY 2026. And so this blue area represents the baseline. The orange area represents the mandated 4% COLA. And then you can see we're starting to build this glide path through the use of the ARPA funds. We did a $30 million retroactive rate increase that went out in November. And so this is just showing that additional 5% between where we are today and the and what the 5.5% ARPA fund does. This is the glide path based on the 5.5%, and this olive or brown colored line represents the incremental increases to get to a fully funded rate. Give you all an opportunity to take this chart in. I know it's complicated. Okay, and so as you can see, based on this glide path, contingent on approvals by the governor's office and the legislature, we would achieve 100% of the fully funded rate in FY 2027. And again, the DDA funding in combination with the reinvestment of the ARPA funds will get us to that blended budgeted rate of 86%. This is basically the table form of what you've just seen, showing the incremental increase over time and the impact it has on the funding percentage. So we are currently working to finalize a multi-phase implementation plan to support providers transitioning to LTSS Maryland, and we'll be releasing additional information in the coming weeks. As you know, in order to help prepare and support providers in their planning for readiness, we have developed and released a provider fiscal impact tool. And in a minute or so, you all will get an overview on how the tool functions to support you in modeling projected revenue in LTSS, Maryland. And so without further delay, I introduce you to Drew Smith from A&M, who will do the overview.
Great, thanks, Robert, and good to see some familiar names on this call. It's been a while since I've had a chance to connect with some of you, but I hope this finds everyone well. And Robert, I'm actually going to see if you can pull that deck back up. We'll start in there before I get into the tool, if you've got it available. Perfect, we can go to the next slide. So as we do a walkthrough of the tool, as Robert said, I think there are a couple of things we want to try to accomplish for the group. First is to talk a little bit about what is the tool intended to do versus what is it not intended to do. Second is to really talk about how the tool is organized, how it functions, starting kind of high level, and then actually working into the tool itself. And then thirdly, come back to, for providers who have gone through this process and who have tested this tool, what is some of the feedback we've heard that made that more successful for them and really more detailed and reliable fiscal projections in the transition to LTSS. So on this slide, you can see an overview of what the tool is intended to do. So really the tool is meant to model the type, duration, and frequency of anticipated services delivered to each participant in the LTSS Maryland DDA module. And so we're really looking at that go forward. We'll see, and as for those of you who have started to work into the workbook already and familiarize yourself, we ask for aggregated PCIS2 data around revenues, but we're not looking at participant by participant PCIS2 revenues. On that note, what we are trying to model is the projected revenue by service type for an agency under the new budgeted rates as Robert described. And so for this, we're looking at group services. Again, as we get into the workbook, you'll be able to see how we've collected those to really understand, as Robert said, the blended rate of 86%, how are providers planning or projecting that the billing under LTSS is going to look by those distinct service types. And then really the big piece here and the intent of the impact analysis is to say, from where things are right now in PCIS2 revenues, moving into LTSS rates and into those revenue models, what's the delta, right? So that's what we want to look at from an organizational level for each of the agencies, and also by a service category level to say, where do we see that there's potentially plus or minus greater impact or less impact across the network of providers. So we can go to the next slide, Robert. So that being said, there are a couple of things that this tool is not intended to do that we just wanted to really come out quite clearly around. So this is not meant to replace cost reporting processes, including capturing staffing and service expense categories. And so what we're really focused on here is the shift in revenue. What we had a lot of conversations early on in the development of this tool is we didn't want to make so many assumptions on how providers are operationalizing these services and the expense categories and classifications that might work into that operationalization as they move into LTSS. So this impact is really looking at the revenue side, is not accounting for the expense side of the equation. And then, the last piece is we are asking organizations to provide participant by participant information, but again, we're not looking at this as a participant by participant analysis. We're looking at this by program and then by organization as a whole. So we do think that as agencies are thinking about their readiness to transition into LTSS Maryland and thinking about what steps they may want to take or may want to model for changes in operational structures as part of that, this data can be useful in that, but we did not build the tool intended to get that delineated in the expense side of and the participant by participant review of the two systems. We can go to the next slide, Robert. So a little bit around how the tool is organized before we jump into it. So the tool was developed to be grouped together by like program or service areas, really to allow the data collection and input to be a little bit more streamlined. And so what you'll see in the tool is we've got community living group home services, supported and shared living, meaningful day, as well as support services. For each program and service, information at the participant level for everyone supported by the agency is being requested. So you'll see that there is an asterisk below there, and that for larger agencies, and we can talk a little bit more about that later about what classifies larger agencies or what a sample selection might look like. There is the opportunity to do a sample of participants. You know, we do really want to make sure that this is representative. What I'll also say is we see this as advantageous to organizations to doing as close to full population as possible in this planning, because it's really going to give the best picture of what it looks like to make this transition. So sampling is an opportunity. We can talk a little bit more around tools that are available in sample selection, but really what we're hoping that agencies who decide to go down this exercise do full population to the extent possible. And then last, services with the geographic differential. So we have built the capacity in the model to look at the geographic differential rates. That changes a little bit dependent on what services we're looking at. So in community living group home, you'll see standard and geographic differential are included together versus meaningful day services. We have separate tabs for that, and we'll talk through a little bit about why that happens that way. We can go to the next tab or slide, Robert. So pretty high level overview of the different sheets within the workbook itself. You know, we really tried pretty hard to make this as user-friendly as possible. There's a lot of data inputs, and we understand that this is a very heavy lift for agencies to pull that data together. And so what we really wanted to build was a template that could be used broadly across all of the different organizations having very different business models and different numbers of participants that they're supporting, but really not make this overly complicated for how data gets inputted to make it a little bit more approachable. So in doing that, we did build out an instructions page. You'll see that on the instructions page, there it is color-coded to the tabs within the workbook. We've tried to highlight or bold really important information that we think is critical to the completion of each of those pages, or things to be mindful of as you're completing those. So as you know, staff are working through this and kind of getting more into the weeds with it, hopefully that provides enough information to help them navigate successfully. Next is the summary tab. So the summary tab is really the roll-up of all of the revenue data for both PCIS2 and LTSS from across the multiple workbooks. Again, to provide a snapshot of the service or programmatic impact between the two systems, and then the organizational as a whole from the programmatic costs or programmatic revenue side. You can do next slide, Robert. Community living group home. So community living group home has the capacity to enter up to 25 group home sites. We know that for some agencies that are larger, that's not going to be enough. What we found in the building of the tool, because of the number of reference points throughout the document, that adding a lot more homes to that page made it pretty clunky and slowed down the processing. And so for agencies that do have more than 25 homes under community living group home, we are asking, and we've included this in the frequently asked questions, that submitting multiple workbooks for that case is fine, and we can work on reconciling all of that data on the back end. But it didn't make sense to build out and kind of make the whole workbook for everybody slow down in that process. So the other note about community living group homes that you'll see when we get into it, so we do have the standard community living group home, right, with overnight support, without overnight support. Also included in that tab is the enhanced support for community living. So I know it's labeled as community living group home. It is a slightly different service, but we have included both of those categorizations, and you'll see that in the drop-down structure. Next, we have supported and shared living. So again, here we have up to 35 sites that can be inputted for shared or supported living. And this also includes the functionality similar to community living group homes for geographic differentials versus shared rates or standard rates, as well as dedicated supports. We can go to the next page, Robert. Okay, so that's when we get into meaningful day. And meaningful day and support services are slightly different in how they operate, primarily with how standard versus geographic differentials are accounted for. So within the two sheets for meaningful day, the data inputs are all the same. Really, the only difference is the rate that's being referenced, and so we've preloaded those. So unlike the the services under community living group home, we found that this was the best approach to make sure that we could allow for enough participants. We weren't getting into a participant by participant determination of standard versus geographic differential. And so we've broken it out into the two tabs. But what you'll see is all of these are the exact same inputs for what we're asking agencies to put in. The only difference there is for the rate that's being referenced for the geographic differential. And we can go to the last page, Robert, on support services. So support services, very similar to Meaningful Day. Again, we've got that broken out so that we can account for the geographic differential around nursing supports between the two different services. So same structure, same inputs, just making sure that we're referencing the right rates in the calculation. So I do want to note that we do not in support services include personal supports or personal supports enhanced. The decision was made to exclude those in the analysis due to the transition to LTSS for those services under EBB. And so they've been omitted from this. So similarly, I know we just talked a little bit about supported living, which also was a service that transitioned to LTSS as part of the EBB process. It has been left in here for agencies that are interested in modeling it. And part of the reason for that is since it is a new service, the thought was that there might be additional agencies or participants who are interested in looking at that service as an option. And so it's been left in there for agencies who are interested in modeling that. For those who are already providing supported living services in LTSS, they can be admitted from the submission in this workbook. We would just ask to make sure that, if you're going to take those services out, if there was anybody who was also included in your PCIS2 revenue data, that they would be admitted as well. All right, so we can go ahead, Robert. I think the next is to start actually jumping into the workbook. So if you want to stop sharing, I can take control here. All right. The most dangerous time of any presentation is switching presenters. All right, can everyone, Robert, can you see my my screen with the workbook on it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hopefully this mirrors pretty closely to what we just walked through. I do want to note that this workbook was released earlier this week. There was some really good feedback provided by some organizations who jumped right into it and started looking at it, areas for clarification, not so much around modifications in the functionality, but there were two that I'll talk about. So the workbook that I'll be walking through today, slightly different from the workbook that was released earlier this week. I believe the plan is to release this version of the workbook immediately after the presentation today or later this afternoon so that agencies have it. I'll talk really quick about what the changes in the two are. And so there were a few spots where we had references to hours when service was actually a quarter unit. The rate was calculating a quarter unit, but we've clarified that in the labeling to make it just a little bit clearer for everyone as they're filling out the data and comparing the results. Functionally, the two differences in the workbooks, the first was on the supported and shared living tab. Home number 7 was locked and not allowing the drop down to function and allowing someone to select what type of home it was. And so we have unlocked that cell. The other change, more significant change, is around the dedicated supports. So previously, dedicated supports had a cap in there for 24 units per day per participant, which would equate to about 6 hours. That's been increased in this iteration to 18 hours or 72 units. And so we will make sure to get that out to everybody on the call, as well as organizations unable to participate. All right, so we'll hop in, and I think we won't spend a whole lot of time here on the instructions page. I want to make sure we have some time for some Q&A at the end. But again, as discussed, we've color coded all of the areas back to the tab, so you'll see your summary tab, community living, really trying to make this, again, as navigable as possible for those who are filling it out. Within the instructions themselves, again, these bolded areas are things that we think are just really important to be keeping track of as you're doing this, kind of that initial, if something's not working, going and making sure that these boxes have been checked to make sure that they've been addressed. And then at the bottom, really what we're hoping to do is limit the number of iterations of the workbook that go out. And so if something is not around the functionality of the workbook that needs to be updated, but is clarification, we're using the frequently asked questions document that was released earlier this week, and we'll be updating that to account for any of those clarifications. So please do keep checking back to that document. I do think we'll be making an update to that document when this workbook goes back out later today, again, based off of some of the really good feedback that we've gotten back from providers asking for some clarification. So if we click into the summary, again, on the summary tab, this is really pulling data from all of the other worksheets and rolling that up into a summation of the overall impact to the organization. One thing to note as you're working through the workbook. So again, trying to keep this as clear and as standardized of how information is being inputted, what information is being inputted. What we've done is anywhere there's yellow, we're asking for an input from the respondent, right? So I'm just going to put agency A here. So as you start to fill out the workbook, keeping an eye on these yellow inputs, really that's the area where we see the most information being needed. It's a little bit different when we get into Meaningful Day and support services. We'll talk a little bit about that and why that happens. So as we get into community living group home, so the community living group home has some of the most moving parts and some of the most critical components to be remembering as you're filling out information for each of the homes. And so as you navigate the sheet, so up here at the top, in the top left, and you'll see this is common across all of the other tabs within the workbook. This will be your running total for LTSS and PCIS2 revenues that are being recorded in the workbook, and then the delta for both as a dollar amount and as a percentage. And so you'll see this continues to live update as you make edits in the book. For each of the homes, again, we've got 25 homes built into the workbook as a starting point. There are 3 inputs at the top that drive our key drivers in the calculation that need to be completed for the rest of the calculations to function. So the first is home type. So again, what we have is with overnight, without overnight, and then with overnight enhanced. So again, talking a little bit of how that enhanced service is showing up in the community living group home. So that needs to be selected. Next is geographic differential or not. So again, if the home qualifies, then it's yes. If not, it's a no. This will reference the correct rate based off of the selection there. So we'll start here as a yes. You'll see the NA, and then you'll see why that's an NA to start. Next is home size. So as most on this call are very aware, the new rate structure for community living group home is driven by number of residents in the home. And so we need to have that to make sure that we're associating to the right rate. So as the right rate is collected, it's referencing the correct daily rate for the house. For those of you finance folks that are in here who want to check those references and those rate lookups, we do have the residential rate lookups at the back of the workbook as well, if you want to take a look at those, or if you want to just use that as a reference point.
Excuse me, Drew.
So, yes.
There's a request to increase the magnification.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't mean to give everybody an eye exam here on a Friday, so thank you for that. All right. Hopefully that is better. If not, Robert, let me know. We can always bump it up a little bit more. So once we've referenced our rate for the home, there are a couple of other inputs. So again, we're looking for these yellow cells that we want to be tracking to. So to avoid any issues with passing back and forth HIPAA information across email systems, what we're asking for is for our home. We're not asking for the address or the specific location, but we are asking for the initials of the resident. So I'm going to change this to a 2-person home. I'm going to use Robert and I as our examples here and how this operates. So me and Robert White. Next input is days per year. So, there was a lot of initial conversation around setting the days per year in community living group home at 360 or 365 as a standard. The decision was made to not do that, but to allow for each home and really each participant to have a unique days per year of what's anticipated for utilization inputted by the agency. So if you have a standard utilization rate that you use for budgeting purposes, you can input that for all of your homes, for all of your participants. Or if that does really vary by the home, then you have the flexibility to do that as well. For our purposes, I'm going to put us at a utilization of 360 days per year. So what you see is that's then taking our daily rate multiplied by our units per year and giving us our annual base rate. Next piece that we're going to look at for this home, for Robert and I, is going to be dedicated supports. So dedicated supports has three options in the dropdown. We have no dedicated supports, we have one-to-one dedicated supports, and two-to-one dedicated supports. So I'm going to pick that I need two-to-one, hopefully. Robert needs one-to-one. And what you'll see again, so we're in the geographic differential, so it's pulling the geographic differential quarter unit rates for those dedicated supports and putting them in there. It's not done any calculations yet because we still have our yellow boxes. So next, we need to say how many dedicated supports on average are we anticipating that I'm going to need versus Robert. And again, those are quarter hour units. So for simple math, I'm going to say that I need 2 hours per day, which is going to equate to 4 quarter-hour units. And Robert's going to need 12 units per day. So again, we've then got our multiplier against our rate, our number of units, and our days per year to get to our dedicated hours total. So then that's going to add up and say, for the home as a whole, that base rate plus those dedicated hours, for the geographic differential of a two-person with overnight support, we now have the home total for the LTSS rates. One last box that we want to input for the comparison here, and that is the PCIS2 total revenue, so that we can compare that. And so for this home, I'm going to model it two ways so that we're not trying to show this is going to fall one way or the other. But let's just say that previously in PCIS2, my revenues were $402,000 per year. So what that's going to show me is the delta in dollars is about $35,000 per year, or an 8.7% increase. Works the other way. If I say that my revenues in PCIS2 previously were $505,000, then it's going to show a reduction of roughly $68,000 or 13%. So then again, as we check the math, that all rolls up into our total here on the page for the service, and again is now rolling over into our total for the summary tab as well. So as you're filling out this workbook, it really is making sure that these first three boxes are complete, and then those days per year. That's what we've seen as folks have had challenges with the calculations. Usually one of those components is missing in the inputs. And so if all of those are selected and inputted, then all of the functioning calculations should work. All right, we're gonna hop over now to supported and shared living. I know there are some questions in the question box that you're tracking, Robert, so we'll make sure we have some time to work through those. Supported and shared living, very similar structurally. Let me make it bigger here. Very similar structurally to the community living group homes. Again, we've got the items up at the top. So we've got shared living levels 1, 2, and 3, and then supported living with overnight and without overnight up to 4 participants in each option. And then we've got the geographic differential versus non-geographic differential. Couple of notes that are critical to these services that are not built into the functionality of the workbook, but we wanted to make sure that people were staying mindful of. So shared living must be set at 360 days per year. So if somebody is selecting to do input for shared living, please make sure to set that at 360 days. And dedicated supports are not available for shared living. So again, as folks are going to model that, we want to make sure that was there for reference, so that there wasn't as much back and forth if somebody accidentally included differences in either of those inputs. All right, let's hop over to meaningful day services, because this has some different layouts and some different inputs. And so just want to make sure we have some time to talk through this and support services. So the way that this workbook is set up is we've got that same kind of ongoing revenue. We have a yellow box up here that I'll talk about in just a moment, but we've got that ongoing revenue. count here. We also have a difference in input. So before, for the community living group homes and supported and shared living, we were doing it at the participant level or at the home level to set utilization. Here, what we've included is a weeks per year that day programs are in operation. And so this, in our testing and conversations early on with some other providers, seemed to be an adequate control. So instead of trying to go day by day or week by week for a participant, instead of looking at, for your organization, on average, how many days or services actively being provided. And so what we've set that at in the workbook is a base of 50, but that can be updated or modified as you're completing your data. So you'll see that our weeks per year changes as we update it up here in this yellow tab. And so if you're operating all 52 weeks, you do have that flexibility to model the difference there as well. So do please keep an eye on that. So if you do run a different operating model, that you're getting that updated. So, similar to the community living group homes, we've got participant initials here. And then across the workbook, we've got all of the different day services. So right now we're in the day services with the standard or the statewide rate. And how we've developed this or broken it out for ease of kind of reference of the inputs is quarter-hour services, so anything that's billed in a 15-minute unit. Monthly services, so this is the employment service follow-along, where you would put in the number of months per year, and then milestone payments. So let's start here on the 15-minute increments. So this is really that opportunity to mix and match services and do some forecasting of what that mixing and matching looks like as a participant moves through different service arrays that you might provide within your organization. And so again, this is all based off of quarter-hour units. And so on a weekly basis, that we're asking how many quarter units do you anticipate is going to happen in career exploration, community development, et cetera, and then by kind of the flavor of each of those services. And so if I am, for example, currently doing day habilitation, I'm doing small groups, and I'm currently doing that for 6 days a week at 6 hours, then that's going to put me at about 144 units. And so, if that's really what somebody's doing, if that's what the PCT looks like, if that's what you anticipate is going to be where that person is spending the majority of their time, and it feels like it's pretty constant that it's going to be that one service, then you can input it in there for the totality of the week. You'll see that it takes the unit rate, it gives you a weekly rate, and then an annualized rate based off of how many weeks per year. Conversely to that, though, is let's say that I'm going to do 100 units in my day habilitation, and then I'm going to do some career exploration for the other 44 units. So what I can see, right, so I now know what I'm looking at for career exploration. That's going to tie up to total for that service across all participants. I now see it for my day habilitation small group. And then at the participant level, I can see how that's falling out based off of the mixture of those rates. So then again, what that all rolls up into is into our totals up here for our LTSS revenue. Now let's talk a little bit about the comparison for PCIS2 revenue. So in the previous tabs, on a home by home basis, we were asking you to input the PCIS2 revenues. Here, what we're asking you to do is to include all of your PCIS2 day program revenues rolled up into one input at the top of the workbook. So that's this yellow box is really asking for all of your revenues out of PCIS2. This is really looking to do the same calculations on the delta for both dollars and percentage of difference. And so understanding that if we were going to put this in for a lot more participants, we would see this being as millions of dollars, but just to keep this all a little bit easier for the comparison, if my previous day rates or day revenues in PCIS2 added up to $30,000 a year, then I'm going to see my delta there of $1,600 or 5.5%. Conversely, if here they were 25,000 in PCIS2, then I'm going to see my dollar difference and percentage difference. So really, this is one overall input. So hopefully, as organizations are looking to gather all of that previous revenue data and rolling it up into this overall day program bucket, that hopefully is not too big of an ask there or a lift as you're pulling it out of PCIS2. One note about that, however, and want to specifically note it for the day services is, in the new rate model, there are more components of service costs that are included, specifically transportation. And so in the billing rate, that transportation assumption is already in the model. And so as you're trying to do this as close to apples comparison as we can between PCIS2 and LTSS, looking at the total program cost for day services out of PCIS2 is going to be the best way to really understand what this looks like moving into LTSS versus being in PCIS2. So including those transportation costs or that transportation revenue, if you're able to pull it out and put it into this bucket of your PCIS2 revenue, I think would give you the best view of moving from one to the other, since it is already included in these rates for LTSS. So the 15-minute unit services, pretty straightforward. A couple of things to note that we want to keep people mindful of. The functionality in the workbook does not cap this at 30 hours of service per week or 40 hours of service per week or anything like that. It does allow you to input as many units for the week as you would like to. And so understanding from a policy and procedural perspective, there are limitations to how much billing can occur for services in the totality of a week. Just be mindful of that. We don't have a math check in there for you, but as your staff or as your teams are going through and completing this, it is something we just want to call out. The workbook will allow you to put in more, which might inflate the LTSS revenues versus what you might be able to actually bill. So do please be mindful for that. For the monthly services, pretty straightforward. This is just asking for the number of months per year. So if we put it at 10, again, we see then the straight calculation off of the monthly rate. Again, number of months to give us our total for the year. For milestone payments, operates a little bit differently. And so what we've asked for in the milestone payments is if this is a milestone that you anticipate a participant is going to achieve during the year, then select one. And what you'll see is the selection of one triggers the milestone payment as a revenue, both in the participant total as well as your count here for your total revenues. So if it is identified that the participant is likely to hit all three milestones for employment services during a year, then you can go ahead and select ones for all three of those. If not, and you think it's going to be kind of a mix and match, you don't have to select multiples. You can just select as many as you think are realistically going to be achieved. Meaningful day, geographic differential. Again, all the exact same inputs, exact same structure. The only difference here are the rates to upload the geographic differential rates, but no other changes in the functionality. Support services. Support services operates, again, very similar to the meaningful day. So we've got the same inputs. We've got weeks per year up here. We've got the total PCIS2 revenues. It's a little bit bigger. Participant initials. And then again, we've grouped this by 15-minute unit services, daily services, and milestone services. And so same inputs. You'll see that not all of the support services are included here. Rest at camp is not included. You'll see that home or vehicle modifications are not included. When we were asked to develop this, it was asked to really kind of focus in initially on some of the higher utilization services. And so we've included here the behavioral support services, nursing services, respite, and omitted some of the other services. So agencies who are interested in looking at those other services not included, hopefully using this structure and building a supporting structure to operate similarly would kind of give you that full picture of what the services or what your revenue streams are going to look like. So again, we're going to get into the support services with the geographic differential. No difference in structure from the standard rate. All the exact same operations, all the exact same inputs for the service. So I do feel like we ran through that relatively quickly, but hopefully just kind of doing a little bit of live inputs on some of these and talking about the functionality is helpful. Again, we really did try to make this as user-friendly as possible for the input side. What I think is probably likely, just just knowing some of the names on this phone call, is getting in and doing some testing with your staff and playing around with the workbook. And hopefully this context helps better understand kind of what the approach can be, or kind of what the structure for inputs can look like. And that might drive to some additional questions that you have, or hopefully it becomes much more clear in how information is going to be inputted. But before we hop into questions, Robert, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and make you the presenter, because I think we have a couple of things on the deck we wanted to talk about before we go into Q&A. All right, so I can hop in here, Robert, and then pass it back to you. So we're fortunate enough to work with a handful of agencies who went through some initial testing of this and really started to try this out and to push it around what does this really look like, and kind of really capture a lot of these scenarios and situations and transition. Got some really great feedback, and so really appreciative to those agencies for helping us in that. We learned some really important lessons, I think, from their experience of going through this process. And the first bullet on here, I think, is what we heard most and loudest was, really going through this process and building dedicated teams to really work through this was the most successful approach. I mean, we're asking for a lot of data here, right? We're asking you to look at what have you been providing to a participant, what do you plan to be providing to a participant. There are a lot of moving pieces between the two systems of, what's in PCPs now for crosswalking back to PCIS2 versus what do we think we're actually going to be using in a new fee-for-service structure. And so really, to the degree you can, building those dedicated teams to really work through this, to think about each of the participants in your organization, and to think about this kind of holistic view of their service delivery, especially in those day services, and really thinking about how you imagine that services are going to be more fluid or more agile in this new structure, as identified as a really good approach to getting the best kind of holistic view of the fiscal impact here and the most reliable. The second is, there's a lot of valuable data in the work that all of the organizations on this phone call have done with their CCSs on PCP development, and using the detailed service authorization tool and the PCPs to really get robust and accurate plans into the system. And so leveraging those PCPs as a part of this data input is going to be really important. But also, as you're doing that, and as you're having these conversations about participants that you're supporting now, and looking at those PCPs, starting to understand, are there going to need to be PCP modifications down the road as you're having these conversations about how these services are really going to operate. Again, as we move into fee-for-service, things that aren't on the plan are things that aren't going to be billed. And so as you're working through this and getting a better sense of what your agency is going to be providing in the future to those you currently serve, keeping mind of that is going to be important. And then again, we talked a little bit about this last bullet on the day services, but for things that are now included in the LTSS rates, like transportation, including that in the PCS2 revenue input is going to provide the best comparison between the two systems and the revenue streams. And so, trying to keep as much of that like-to-like data as possible. One note that you'll see on the updated FAQs that will come out later today: contribution to care. So in the current rate modeling that we have in the spreadsheet, we do not deduct contribution of care. This is just looking at the rates themselves out of LTSS. And so when you're pulling in the comparison data from PCIS2, not having that deduction for contribution of care will get you your most accurate view of the residential services in those two. So we've updated that just to document it in the FAQs that will be coming out later today. And I think, Robert, with that, I will pass it back to you.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Drew. So ongoing to support and questions. Ongoing to support, each region's fiscal team has been trained on the tool, including its functionality and the data inputs. And so agencies needing additional assistance should contact their regional fiscal team lead for support. If for some reason you don't know who that is, please feel free to send me an email and I'll get you connected to the right individual. Once the tool has been completed, providers can email it to me at robert.white2@maryland.gov. Please make sure that you put fiscal impact analysis in the subject line. Once you completed the tool and you've turned it into me, those files will be forwarded to Hilltop to complete an aggregated analysis of the findings from the tool. And when we receive that analysis, obviously that will go into informing any kind of future rate reviews or development. Yes, here we go. This is a list of the fiscal leads at each of the regional offices here. You all should have this in the handout that's attached to the webinar. And again, if for some reason you don't know who your fiscal lead is, feel free to send me an email. Okay, Q&A. So we have received lots of questions. And so in order to keep this session productive, I'm going to focus on the questions that are related to the tool. We will answer every question that we receive and update the frequently asked questions document. There were some folks in there asking for the link as well, and so we will be sure to send that link out. So the first question is, what cost of living or inflation percentage did we use in calculating the glide path? And so the COLA in the glide path is based on the 4% mandated COLA through FY26. Okay. A question for you, Drew. Has the Excel spreadsheet been fixed for the group home section?
I might need a little bit more clarification, so we might ask that maybe that question, whoever posed that question, maybe follow up with you, Robert, to give us a little bit more detail. In our testing, everything is functioning. Again, we did make some modifications this week into the tool. That revised tool will go out to everybody, which might fix the issue that's being referenced by the question.
Okay, great. Are the rates in the impact analysis tools at the fully loaded rate, and therefore we should consider those at the 86% funded and not the total revenue shown in the tool? No, the rate that is loaded in the impact analysis tool is the 86% funded rate, not the fully funded rate. So we've already done that math for you. So all you need to do is provide the inputs that Drew identified during his overview of the tool. Okay. If you provide a ratio of 2 to 4 overnight staff, how do you capture that in this tool? Drew?
Yeah, so a couple different ways I think that could be addressed. I would guess that this is probably related more to the use of dedicated hours. I don't know if it's in relation to the way that the rate is developed with overnight support. But I'll take it from the dedicated support side. So you could look at that. So if you've got I'm assuming the 2 to 4 is 2 staff to 4 participants. But this will work either way. So 2 staff to the 4 participants, if that is dedicated, and I know that there were some updates in the policy around what can be a shared dedicated support. And so, if I will hold that, and we might need to follow up with Rhonda Workman from DDA to give a written response on the definition there, or you can look at policy stat. But if that is the case, then you could use the 1-to-1 dedicated supports or the 2-to-1 dedicated supports, depending on how that ratio is being referenced here, to then account for the number of shared staff or dedicated staff in the home for those overnight supports. So again, if it's for 6 hours at night, then you could do the 24 units of one-to-one dedicated supports. If there is a participant who needs that level of support throughout the night and there is that enhanced staffing need.
Great, thank you, Drew. We have received several questions regarding personal supports and whether or not the personal supports rates will be reduced or impacted by the 86%. And so the answer to that question is yes, personal supports is part of that blended rate of 86%. However, due to some changes we made to the BLS wage, providers should see a net increase in personal supports, even with the funding aid percentage. Okay. Current COVID funding would be excluded, correct? And so yes, as you are updating the tool with your PCIS2 revenue to keep things apple to apple, you would exclude anything related to the Appendix K flexibilities. If there's some confusion around that, please feel free to reach out to me and we can have a discussion around that.
And Robert, just to validate that also, in the upcoming release of the FAQs, that is also identified and clarified, just so if people want to go back to reference it.
Okay, great, thank you. How do we enter the days that dedicated hours are being used for group home community living? Column G only allows you to enter the hours per day. Drew, question for you.
So let me see if I can clarify. So under community living group home, so the way that we have it set up for dedicated supports, you're correct. Column G allows you to enter the number of units. So again, that is up to 18 hours a day or 72 units of the service. And so, you know, if there's something that you need specifically that's not allowing for in the input for community living group home, you know, send Robert an email. We can talk a little bit more about it. But for the way that you know the service is meant to operate or be billed and captured, this should capture everything for the dedicated supports unless somebody needs more than 18 hours. And you know, we can talk about some of the policy constraints around that, around total staffing allowable and house using dedicated supports that is on policy staff. But yeah, please, if you play with the tool and you feel like it's not adequately capturing what you're getting at around dedicated supports, send Robert an email and we can look at it and maybe hop on the phone and talk to it a little bit.
Okay, great. Thank you, Drew. Okay. For the meaningful day tabs, must we use participant initials? The concern that this individual has is that, you know, some folks share initials, and so they just want to know if they can use an internal ID to identify the individuals that do not fall under PHI. And the answer is yes, you can use an internal identifier in lieu of the initials.
The only piece I would maybe add to that, Robert, and thinking about the support from regional staff is don't randomize that ID. So something that your team is familiar with. So if there is a follow-up question around a specific participant in the workbook or just clarification, that you know, if those are fully randomized, we might not be able to find that person back specifically. So as long as there's something to tie it back to, that should work fine.
Okay, so we are at time. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we will answer every question that we receive. We received a lot of great, thoughtful questions. And so we'll be sure to get those questions answered and incorporate it into the current frequently asked questions document. And so with that, Michelle, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending.